Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and welcome to our home here in Ream Library. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports a variety of lectures, programs, conferences that explore basic questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can learn more about those programs online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. And today's lecture will also be recorded and posted online in a couple of days, so you can tell your friends what they've missed, those of them who are being more contemplative right now but want to watch it at midnight or something like that. I'm pleased today to welcome Brian Robinette, Associate Professor of Theology at Boston College, to speak on a timely theme that really deserves more attention than it gets, entirely fitting in the world we have today, and at Holy Cross: contemplation in an age of anger. It's central to a Holy Cross education to help educate students who can be what the Jesuits call contemplatives in action, persons with ongoing reflective capacity to think deeply about the needs of the world and about their own place in it, and equally committed to improving the world that they inherit. I'm grateful to Dean Matt Egemeyer and Professor Peter Fritz, wherever Peter's hiding. There's Peter. For drawing Brian's recent work to my attention and making today's event possible. Actually, Brian and I met, we were deciding, at least 20 years ago. Since then, he's followed his own contemplative journey, or during that time, I guess I met you early in that, and to arrive at his current position. He was an aspiring rock drummer who studied music business at Belmont University in Nashville. He left a job in advertising after college to work as a church janitor. He craved a quiet, contemplative life. Don't tell your parents this is the path we have down for you. They may get nervous, right? After a year of discernment and with the guidance of a spiritual mentor, Brian set on his path to becoming a theology professor, earning an MA at St. John's University and a PhD at Notre Dame, and he and his wife, Liz, both became Catholic as well. He first taught at St. Louis University and has been at BC for the last decade, where his courses include theology in a secular age, spiritual exercises, engagement, empathy, and ethics, and Thomas Merton, monk, mystic, and prophet. He's author of the book Grammars of Resurrection, A Christian Theology of Presence and Absence, published in 2009, and The Difference Nothing Makes, Creation, Christ, and Contemplation, to be published early next year. Brian's talk is one of the Deitchman Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity. We're grateful to the Deitchman family for making that possible. John Deitchman of the class of 1970. Please join me in welcoming Brian Robinette.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. And thank you for the hospitality. It's really wonderful to see so many students out there. And when I was asked about the possibility of doing this talk, it was specifically mentioned that there could be a decent number of students show up. And so I was thinking, when crafting this talk, of my students, maybe even my freshmen or some of my upperclassmen at Boston College, what might be really useful, engaging for them. Of course, I hope that this will be useful and engaging for everybody, but it's the students that I have in mind, and especially students who are probably exercised with concerns for justice, for their world. And so what role does contemplative practice have in that? That's the basic charge of my talk, and I hope that this is going to make good on that charge. So, contemplation in an age of anger. The title of my lecture today takes its inspiration from two sources. The first is from a 1968 essay written by the American Trappist monk, poet, and social activist Thomas Merton, who would die later that year. Entitled Contemplation in a World of Action, Merton sought to give a partial defense of the contemplative life in the modern world. I say partial because while he was aware that the sensibilities of his time made monastic life seem out of touch, his main interest was not to defend monastic life per se, but to offer a sober plea for the cultivation of the contemplative life among us all, especially those of us who are not professed monastics. What is meant by contemplation? Well, we'll explore that in what's to come. But for now, we could suggest, along with Merton, that it is, as he puts it, a special dimension of inner discipline and experience, a certain integrity and fullness of personal development. Merton stresses that if ours is an age of action, a time of explosive technological advance, a time of massive social upheaval, a time when our very sense of being is dominated by doing and producing, then we need all the more to cultivate the contemplative dimensions of life, not as a buffer from change and uncertainty, but as a way of access to the inmost resources of freedom, self-understanding, and compassion in their midst. Merton writes this: "We have more power at our disposal today than at any other time than we have ever had, and yet we are more alienated and estranged from the inner ground of meaning and of love than we have ever been. The result of this is evident. We are living through the greatest crisis in the history of man, and this crisis is centered precisely in the country, America, that has made a fetish out of action and has lost or perhaps never had the sense of contemplation. Far from being irrelevant, prayer, meditation, and contemplation are of the utmost importance in America today." The second inspiration for my title today comes from Pankaj Mishra's Age of Anger, A History of the Present, which was published in 2017. An Indian essayist, novelist, and fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, Mishra provides a portrait of the pervasive sense of resentment across the globe. Informed by social scientific analysis, Mishra is even more interested in the existential dimensions of our age. How does it feel to live in a time of massive social upheaval, ecological precarity, and a claustrophobic sense of news and social media that keep us in a state of hypervigilance? In 1968, Hannah Arendt could declare that every country has become the almost immediate neighbor of every other country, and every man feels the shock of events which take place at the other end of the globe. Well, how much more applicable is this statement to a time when we can doom scroll through the news feeds on our phones over a cup of coffee to learn about the newest despotic outburst, the latest dire prediction of climate change, the grim update on economic inequality, and the most recent threat of nuclear war? Drawing upon Arendt, but also Friedrich Nietzsche, Mishra observes that the pressure cooker of our times can make it seem that everyone is against everybody else, a condition we might summarize as ressentiment. This is a quote: "An existential resentment of the other people's being, caused by an intense mix of envy and sense of humiliation and powerlessness. Ressentiment, as it lingers and deepens, poisons civil society and undermines political liberty, and is presently making for a global turn to authoritarianism and toxic forms of chauvinism." This lurch towards authoritarianism is a clear symptom of wide-scale political and ideological polarization, which seems to seep into virtually every pore of interpersonal and social life. Have you noticed? Everyone must everywhere take sides. In our town halls and city streets, in our local school boards and universities, in our news and social media platforms, even our churches. As a recent report from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops puts it, polarization has made virtually every affinity group within the church, whether conservative or liberal or somewhere in between, feeling an unprecedented level of, quote, animosity and, quote, feeling judged by others in the church. And that includes people in church leadership. Now, if you feel your blood pressure rising as I speak, or if your heart is sinking, know that my point is not to whip up feelings of anger or fear or despair. But neither is my intent to leave these feelings unaddressed. In fact, I wish to connect with the feeling world, the felt sense of living in an age of anger, and summon creative and compassionate resources precisely in its midst. Resources that do not so much come by dint of our cleverness or sheer will, but by deepest allowance. I hope I may be forgiven, therefore, after having dredged all of this up, by admitting that I come with no major proposals to address the problems I've raised. Instead, I wish to invoke the way of contemplation into the mix, not as an analgesic, but as a means for accessing a refuge and an actual power present already within us, in the very ground of our being, so as to endure, heal, and even flourish in a time such as this. In a word, I wish to speak of the inner ground of hope. So, what do I mean by contemplation? And what does it have to do with the so-called real-world problems to which I have alluded? Well, the question framed this way is perfectly understandable, but there is a hitch. It presumes that there is some thing called contemplation, which we might conjure up and apply, as though there were a contemplative solution to problems X, Y, or Z. So, a word of caution. There is not a contemplative strategy to any problem, if by this we mean some kind of technique or secret knowledge that has special, perhaps mystical properties to it. If anything, contemplation is approached by recognizing the limits of our cleverness and demand for results. To be sure, the contemplative way may well involve skills and dispositions so as to facilitate the integration of contemplation in life. And yet this path will invariably entail the long letting go of our habitual tendency to grasp at special experiences or turn everything, including the spiritual life, into a 5-point action plan. Does this mean that contemplation has nothing to do with meaningful change? Not at all. But as Merton puts it, those who wish to act and do things for others or for our world without accessing the deepest capacities for self-understanding, freedom, and love will not have much to offer others, but will likely communicate the contagion of their submerged aggression, egoic ambitions, and doctrinaire prejudices and ideas. I will return to that stark warning a bit later, but for now I want to gesture at, rather than define, contemplation with a few references. So consider the following from Richard of St. Victor, an influential 12th century Christian theologian and contemplative. He writes, "Contemplation is a free and clear vision of the mind fixed upon the manifestation of wisdom in suspended wonder." Notice in this succinct summary that contemplation has to do with the liberation of the mind from distraction and prejudice. Vision does not mean seeing visionary phenomena. Rather, it suggests transparency and lucidity. And notice, too, that the reference to mind here does not imply thinking or what we call discursive activity. This isn't a rationalism that aims at some sensory object or conceptual problem, which it might grasp. It refers to our deepest capacities for knowing, which, while not excluding discursive thought, is more direct and intuitive, more receptive and capacious in character. This point is further suggested by the reference to wisdom and suspended wonder. For whereas the thinking process is typically sequential, moving from this, then to that, then inferring this, then concluding that, the quality of contemplative knowing is rooted in wide-eyed wonderment, for beholding reality as it is, rather than seizing it, for being held or suspended by a subtler power of knowing, that senses an immediate rapport with reality and its dynamic wholeness. Again, this doesn't mean that contemplative knowing is incompatible with the hard work of solving problems, but contemplative knowing draws from dimensions that run deeper than ego-based thought. As Merton puts it in his New Seeds of Contemplation, contemplation is a sudden gift of awareness, an awakening to the real with all that is real, a vivid awareness of infinite being at the roots of our own limited being. Now, lest this statement make contemplation seem so rarefied as to be irrelevant to ordinary human life, let me suggest that this gift of awareness is so readily available to us, so immediately present, that we tend to look right over it most of the time. It's not that contemplative knowing is an extraordinary mystical state of consciousness that stands above and beyond ordinary experience. This deeper awareness is actually available to us all the time, at the very root of our being, but typically obscured through the accretions of emotionally laden thought patterns that dominate and polarize our immediate attention. Such deeper knowing has only to be revealed or unveiled rather than manufactured, which is why the most characteristic feature of contemplative practice is really one of opening and allowing, of receiving and beholding, a kind of unknowing, as the Christian contemplative tradition puts it. While seemingly passive when compared to modes of knowing that depend upon mastery, contemplative knowing is in fact an activity of the profoundest sort, a free and utterly wakeful engagement with whatever is present, just as it is, with simplicity of attention. To develop these points further, allow me to read an extended passage by Martin Laird, who's an Augustinian monk and professor of theology at Villanova, who here is working out of the Christian tradition. This comes from his book, Into the Silent Land, A Guide to the Christian Practice of Contemplation, published in 2006. It's really a modern classic, I say. He writes, "Contemplative practice doesn't acquire anything. In that sense, and in an important sense, it is not a technique, but a surrendering of deeply embedded resistances that allows the sacred within to gradually reveal itself as a simple fundamental fact. We discover in the process that there is more depth within us than we ever dreamt. There is not only chaos, confusion, emotional attachment, anxiety, and anger's nettled memory, not just the marvel of discursive reason, imaginative insight, and unconscious insight, but also an abyss of awareness that is always flowing with bright obscurity, grounding all these mental processes, one with all and one with God." A few features of this passage. The first is that in no way is this deeper awareness arrived at by some kind of egoic striving or willfulness. The fundamental disposition here is one of willingness, of releasing and receptivity, of allowing and recognizing. There is a nakedness of intention here, a simple act of recollection that is fully engaged yet non-possessive. In a climate of contemplative practice, we come to recognize, quite amazingly, that in the midst of the perceptions, feelings, and thought patterns that are constantly swarming and buzzing through our consciousness, there remains a basic luminous awareness that is utterly peaceful, welcoming, and grounded. This is almost impossible for us to believe at first, because normally we are so riveted by the content of our experience as it disperses attention this way and that, towards this feeling or that memory, now this perception or that narrative pattern, sprung by this impulse or besieged by this encounter. we typically don't recognize that underlying such dispersal is an ineffable yet unfailing presence of wholeness. Like a fish that does not suspect the water in which it swims, we remain unaware of the inherently open and radiant awareness that allows for anything like experience to occur, and which connects us to all reality, including the source and ground of reality, God. We literally look over what is silently and unassumingly underneath our noses. Of course, this is not to suggest that the ever-shifting content of experience is something to be gotten rid of or suppressed, but only to point out that the noisy rush of feelings and thoughts that so often dominate our lives arise out of, without ever exhausting, the vast silent depths in which we live and move and have our being, to paraphrase St. Paul. To recognize this depth dimension is among the most revolutionary discoveries we could ever have. God does not know how to be absent, writes Martin Laird. Yes, it is true that most of us, most of the time, experience alienation from the ground of our being. And yet such separation is the great illusion in which we are caught. We get trapped in our fragmented experience, in our thought patterns and emotional entanglements, in our identity-building projects, in our projections upon others, or their projections upon us. Perhaps we imagine God as some object over there in the distance, needing our guilt-ridden efforts to become worthy of love. Or perhaps God doesn't register as any point of concern at all, a mere fantasy. Whatever we may presently think about God, the classical Christian tradition does not regard God as some big other hovering at the edge of the empirical universe, occasionally intervening here and there, if at all. God is the ineffable source and ground of all that is, and thus intimately present to all that is, nearer to us than we are to ourselves, as St. Augustine puts it. If we have grown accustomed to this illusion of separateness from God, from each other, from ourselves, from the whole of created reality, then what we really need is the dispelling of this illusion. A quiet, if pervasive sense that who and what we are is rooted in an unconditioned reality that gives all things their shared being. Now, to this point, I have spoken of contemplation in terms that presuppose some regular practice, even seasons of practice. Such practice basically consists of dedicated periods of time when a person, individually or in community, settles into sustained, wakeful, and prayerful repose. With variations found throughout the world's diverse wisdom traditions, East and West, such practice is commonly associated with specific body postures, rhythmic breathing, sometimes the use of a mantra or a prayer word, and connections with sacred spaces conducive for interior silence. To the extent that contemplative practice entails skills and habits that can be developed over time, it is appropriately understood as a way of life that accompanies other practices, including ritual, communal discernment, and ethical formation. If I have drawn mainly from a Christian perspective thus far, I wish to emphasize the importance of engaging in interfaith learning as well. And I have here in mind the kind of collaborative, contemplative training in which the gifts of distinctive traditions can be shared. And so, speaking for myself as a Christian, I have benefited enormously from engagement with the Buddhist tradition over the years, especially Tibetan Buddhism. And so I would like to bring this element to the fore, knowing that my audience here is religiously diverse, or perhaps religiously curious, or maybe a little religiously skeptical. The following is an extended quotation from a former colleague, John McCransky, a Lama within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and a scholar who taught at Boston College for many years and engaged extensively in Christian Buddhist dialogue. And this particular book actually reflects his many years of teaching undergraduates like yourselves. This is from his book, Awakening Through Love, Unveiling Your Deepest Goodness, published in 2007. And here's the extended quote. He writes, "For authentic spiritual progress, something has to interfere with all such patterns of self-centered deception, undercut them so decisively that our innate capacity for self-transcending, all-inclusive love can actually manifest an actual power of goodness, not just a belief in goodness. That requires effective methods of practices that are not just forms of individual and social identification with self-protective beliefs. We have to learn to let our innate, pure awareness come to self-recognition, to thoroughly sense its own empty, cognizant, and limitless nature, and to stabilize in that recognition. Then the energies of our self-centered thoughts and emotions can be freed to take expression as enlightened attitudes and activities of compassion." The first thing to notice about this passage is how directly it corresponds with what we previously saw with Martin Laird. Namely, that there is a depth dimension within each of us that is inherently open, luminous, and unfailingly present, even in the midst of our mind-generated dramas and afflictive emotional states. Moreover, this depth dimension is not empty in the sense of being inert. Emptiness refers here to pure potentiality, to creative capacity, and to the interrelatedness of all beings. McFarland does not hesitate to call it an actual power of goodness that is prior to any idea of it, and which can manifest in our lives when unimpeded by attachments and identity-protective habits. In other words, our true nature is primordially good, unbounded in its capacity for inclusive love and relationship, and yet this nature is obscured and distorted when filtered through the narrow confines of self-grasping. And that is the core problem. Namely, that we find ourselves, mostly unconsciously, reacting out of fear. Fear of the ceaseless flow of reality, fear of the vast depths of our own being, fear of our feelings, fear of fear, fear of others, fear of death. Not knowing what to trust or whether to trust, we retreat into limited constructions of identity that we imagine are comprehensible and permanent. We curve in on ourselves, incurvatus in se, as St. Augustine put it, and grasp at a reified sense of self which we struggle to prop up and defend, but always at the expense of a more fundamental truth, that there is no self separate from the other. Yet, in the face of the ceaseless flow of experience, which seems to threaten our intentions and projects, we superimpose images, labels, and reductive categories for what, in fact, are inherently interdependent and dynamic relations. If at one level it is entirely appropriate to make some distinction between self and other, between this thing and that thing, the problem is that we constantly mistake these conventional distinctions for ultimate reality. This is the essence of reification, thingification, and it occurs on many scales in human relations, ranging from the interpersonal level to the construction of social in-groups in contrast to out-groups that seem to threaten our identity. In other words, clinging to self assumes collective, not just individualized forms, and becomes established as social, institutional, and cultural habits. Conflict, violence, or just plain indifference to human suffering become sedimented in our history through such habits, only to replicate themselves at higher levels of organization. That is, they become systemic, larger-than-life forces that self-generate through social conditioning. Which is why, as McFarland insists, Any meaningful social change will also, and even more fundamentally, require an intervention on the personal level. For somehow, at some point, we all need to learn how to withdraw our cooperation with these cycles and discover for ourselves a power of goodness and love that is truly sustainable and worthy of our trust. The micro practices of spiritual transformation must go hand in hand with the macro practices of social change. We often talk of the latter, but rarely do we take the former seriously. I will briefly return to some of the social dimensions of this analysis in the conclusion of my talk, but here I wish to shift for a moment and consider how contemplative practice can help us with the felt sense of living in an age of anger. Of course, I do not wish to imply that all of us feel the same way or to the same degree, and yet I'd say that probably all of us in this room has felt various shades of resentment and despair over the seemingly intractable problems of our time, and just as likely we have gone through or will go through stretches of empathic distress and burnout as a result. I invoke the term empathy burnout here, which is a term typically used to refer to those in helping professions, medical professionals, clergy, teachers, police officers, therapists, and so on, who suffer from regular exposure to the suffering of others. But the effects of empathy burnout are felt across broad swaths of the population. Helplessness and irritability, numbness and the desire to withdraw, waning concentration and the lack of joy. Sound familiar? According to a recent survey by the United Way, Americans across all demographics have experienced a noticeable increase in empathy burnout, not only because of the pandemic, but especially due to the hothouse effect generated by relentless exposure to news cycles and social media. We're collectively drained, the report reads, overwhelmed and losing our patience. As a result, feelings of numbness, compassion fatigue, or empathy burnout start to creep in. Now, there are no easy solutions to the effects of burnout due to these problems, though I think it justified to make at least one appeal right away, namely that we spend considerably less time cooperating with a media ecology that seems hell-bent upon commanding our attention through constant shock, outrage, fear, and distraction. In the so-called attention economy, where our very capacity for attending has become a commodity, hijacked by commercial interests and dehumanizing algorithms, we should consider the cultivation of awareness, of contemplative interiority, a quietly revolutionary act. What one pays attention to and how is the subtlest, most basic of spiritual arts. Related to this cultivation of interiority, there is great need in our time for learning how to better attend to our feelings, to be with our feelings, to learn from them, to be wise with them, whatever their intensity, tonality, and texture. And this, too, is a revolutionary act. If only because most of the time we are either driven by our feelings without really knowing it, or we try to repress our feelings as a kind of defense against them. We are often afraid of our feelings without resources for knowing how to accommodate them, for processing them, or allowing them just to be. But here, in the feeling world, lies an important opportunity. The opportunity for accessing resources of sustainable compassion, and even joy for ourselves and for the benefit of others. In 2015, on the occasion of the Dalai Lama's 80th birthday, the recently deceased Archbishop Desmond Tutu traveled to Dharamsala, India, in order to share a week-long series of conversations with his good friend. The remarkable friendship of these two men over the years and the playful exchanges they were known to have is wonderfully illustrative of a friendship in the making between two great traditions, Christianity and Buddhism. Captured in a book-length transcription of their dialogues, the Book of Joy offers a deep dive into the art of joy and compassion in the midst of personal and social suffering. No Pollyannish recipe. Both men witnessed suffering on a terrifying scale in the form of political exile and genocide. And yet both remain convinced that joy is possible when we are animated by compassion. This hardly implies the denial of strong emotions. Anger, for instance. For Archbishop Tutu, there is a role for legitimate anger in the face of injustice. He said in one of his engagements with the Dalai Lama, righteous anger is usually not about oneself. It is about those whom one sees being harmed and one wants to help. And so there is an intelligence to this kind of anger, a pathic knowing that is alert to something that just simply ought not be, and which issues in a desire to intervene. Our recognition of injustice springs from such sentiments, and we should honor them, even if anger is not sustainable in itself. But to repress anger in the name of some abstract peace or anodyne happiness is not possible, nor is it healthy, for it will express itself in some other way, as sadness, numbness, seething contempt. He adds, I do at times get very angry with God. You can go to God and speak all you have, pouring it out in that fashion. Indeed, the prophets express in the biblical tradition something of the pathos of God, and this is one of the reasons why the prophet Jeremiah was his favorite. Prophetic anger shares in a kind of judgment. It bears within it a perception of value. It recognizes a good worth defending. It is mobilizing, potentially a force for good. And yet, as Tutu adds, when left to itself, anger readily devolves into contempt, spite, red-hot hate. It easily spreads in indiscriminate fashion with a tipping point not easily resisted. That is, without another kind of wisdom that goes deeper than even our righteous indignation. When I refer to the age of anger in this talk, I do not necessarily mean this prophetic anger, of which Desmond Tutu speaks. And it's crucial to know the difference. To put it simply, when Pankaj Mishra names ours an age of anger, he's referring mainly to widespread resentment, in which the very being of the other is the occasion for envy or contempt. The pervasiveness of resentment in our culture today is stunning. It's openly celebrated in some quarters. And so it behooves each of us, especially those of us who feel strongly about social justice, to be honest about how quickly we rationalize our contempt for others. You know, those people. For not only will such contempt hide ways in which we may carry some self-contempt, but it will block the possibility that we have something to learn from those people, including how to live with them. Clarity about the interdependence of self and other, us and them, is key to this wisdom, which brings us to the deepest foundation for living in an age of anger: compassion. What is remarkable about genuine compassion is that it is radically inclusive of self and other. As the Dalai Lama frequently notes with his Christian companion, when we are more deeply in touch with our own suffering, compassion for the suffering of others tends to grow. This is highly counterintuitive to most ears, since the idea of being open to the suffering of others seems to compound our own. But what the Dalai Lama means here is not a duplicating process. He's referring to a contemplative wisdom that allows us to look deeply into our own suffering with open awareness as an act of acknowledgement and kindness, but without being swallowed up by it. Kindness to suffering? Yes, but because the more we repress our suffering or run away from it, the more reactive we will become, and the more suffering grows. But when we allow ourselves to be present to our suffering, really present to our feelings of despair or numbness, to our anger or fear, even to our resentment, then to that extent do we allow for a wisdom and compassion to issue forth that proves deeper than all such feelings and reactive thought patterns. What is remarkable is that our capacity for accommodating our own, as our capacity for accommodating our own suffering grows, to that extent we are able to be present to the suffering of others. There is a direct, not inverse relation. More remarkable yet, the more we are truly present to our own suffering and the suffering of others with this deeper compassion and wisdom, the more joyous it's possible to be in the midst. As the Dalai Lama puts it, he writes, "If you develop a strong sense of concern for the well-being of all sentient beings, and in particular all human beings, this will make you happy. This is the value of compassion, of having compassionate feelings for others. Even, you see, 10 minutes or 30 minutes of meditating upon compassion, on kindness for others, and you will see its effects all day." This is a testable hypothesis, by the way. That's the way to maintain a calm and joyous mind. And here, with this connection between clarity of mind, wisdom, and the feeling world, compassion, we have the beating heart of this talk. Sustainable compassion and joy come from accessing and becoming ever more stabilized in a wisdom that runs deeper than all our reductive thought patterns and emotional entanglements. Martin Laird refers to this wisdom as interior silence. John McCransky calls it spaciousness of mind. In any case, contemplative awareness is naturally expansive and radiantly clear. It is not manufactured by effort, but is simply recognized and relaxed into. As we settle ever more trustingly in it, we discover the capacity for welcoming our feelings and thoughts without being submerged by them. We can allow them to be, and this allowance is kindness. All of our anger and fear is welcomed here. All of our feelings of numbness and despair are given room. All of our mental projections and fragmented narrative patterns are permitted to open up, settle, possibly heal. There is no indulgence of these thoughts and feelings, but neither is there any repression or running away from them. It is the eye of a hurricane, and to know this innate capacity for clarity and wisdom in the midst of confusion is among the greatest discoveries we could ever have about ourselves. It is the inner ground of hope. Conclusion. Throughout this talk, I have focused mainly on the micro-practice of contemplation and how such practice is indispensable for not merely coping with, but maybe even flourishing in the midst of our age of anger. In the face of what can seem like the headwinds of a psychosocial storm, we need to access all the more a refuge, an actual power of goodness within us, in the very ground of our being, so as to permit the transmutation of confusion into clarity, of empathic distress into compassionate resolve, of polarized fragmentation into community. Without this inmost refuge and power, many of our efforts to change the world will be, as Merton warned, conditioned by our defensive mechanisms and projections upon others. He writes this, "Without a more profound understanding derived from exploration of the inner ground of human existence, love will tend to be superficial and deceptive. Calls for action today are everywhere to be found, many of them contradictory to one another. Too seldom are such calls attentive to the interior life, and thus to the kind of transformation we ourselves must undergo in order to embody the kind of change we might advocate." In light of Merton's reference, let me just mention 3 brief recommendations in the form of encouragements that touch upon practice of contemplation in our time. The first is this: practice. While contemplative awakening is itself a gift, there is a practice to it that enables us to become more open to this gift and more skillful in integrating contemplation into our personal lives and social engagements. All of the authors I've discussed today are clear on this point, and so I can warmly recommend each of the texts that I've drawn upon as powerful resources for beginning or enriching an already established spiritual practice. We need training and guidance in the contemplative way, as well as regularity. That's very important. And the practical advice found in these texts and others like them can be welcomed as a transmission of time-tested wisdom. My second encouragement is this: don't go it alone. Too often today, we think of spiritual practice in individualistic terms, as a self-help technique to become more emotionally regulative or cognitively focused, more productive. Mindfulness practices abound in our society today, many of them premised upon psychological framings that reinforce a sense of a distinct psychological subject working upon itself. Without denying the benefits that come from these popularized forms of spiritual practice, it seems all the more important in an age of anger to draw upon the resources of spiritual benefactors and a supportive community. As John McCransky so powerfully notes, we need to grow in our capacity for receiving love from others, from our benefactors, in order to grow in our capacity for extending love to others. These benefactors can be people more proximate to us, or they can be spiritual benefactors who help make up a living tradition of wisdom and care. In any case, find a community, or be more intentional with the community you're already engaged in. Draw upon the strength of others and serve them, and do not let the fear of commitment become an obstacle. And finally, widen the scope. Widen the scope of what we take our community to be. For while there is no question that we need a supportive community for spiritual growth, our age of anger is one that feeds upon suspicion of those who are not a part of our affinity groups. There is a remarkable degree of sorting going on in our society today, and it plays into an us-them balkanization that only perpetuates reductive labeling and misunderstanding and the hardening of hearts. A potent antidote to such sorting, however, is for persons to be more intentional about mixing it up, spending more time with those whose values seem very different from our own. If you want to know how to test the degree of spiritual maturity, just spend time with people you disagree with. We talk a lot about diversity these days, as well we should, but too often what we mean by diversity doesn't include diversity of perspectives and values that undergird them. For such encounters to occur, we need to suspend for a time our automatic judgments, become less attached to our present understanding of things, and be less polarized by perspectives other than our own. We need to be curious about the values of those with whom we disagree. Above all, we need to inspire confidence in others that however much we may differ in perspective, sometimes vigorously, that they are genuinely seen and heard, even loved, and not merely subjects of our disdain. We need, in other words, to see ourselves in one another, rather than as ideological talking points, facing off with one another. As Merton writes in one of his journals, the more I am able to affirm others, to say yes to them in myself, by discovering them in myself and myself in them, the more real I am. I am fully real if my heart says yes to everyone. This does not mean the vapid and careless friendliness that accepts everything by thinking of nothing. There is much that one cannot affirm and accept. But first, one must say yes where one really can. This may seem like a modest aim, but in an age of anger, if deeply practiced, can actually go a long way. Thank you for your attention.
Hi. I was just wondering, what would you think was the catalyst for this kind of us versus them mindset? Why did it become adopted as somewhat of the mindset of the future?
I think that this us versus them is a perennial problem for our species. So in a way, we can speak of different periods in which it has become intensified, and maybe even to the point of, say, great conflict, where us and them erupts into an effort of mutual elimination, or the elimination of them by us. But there is something about our human nature that, though that doesn't necessarily lead to that kind of polarization, is maybe susceptible to it. And I'll give you an example. If you've ever seen two toddlers in a room with one another, and there might be multiple toys in the room, and they're playing and so forth, and if you were to make a guess as to which of the toys they're going to go after, is it the fuzzy one, the red one, the shiny one? Well, what do you think it is? The same one. You ever notice that? You ever notice how we're drawn to what others are drawn to? And, and I have two boys. They're teenagers now. But my home was a living laboratory of watching this. And what basically happens is that when two of us become affixed by the desires of others, we find it desirable, more desirable. Look at what so-and-so holds, and it becomes an object of fascination, and we might reach for it. And then, but in the reaching for it, there's a kind of conflict between the two. And so, this happens in so many ways, in trivial ways, with little bouncy balls and playrooms, but it also happens in terms of how people fight over prestige or dignity. That they see, there's a sort of a competitiveness, that they see others, and if they feel that they're being impinged upon or something, they might feel the need, almost the spontaneous urge to compete with that need over and over again. I mean, the logic of war is very much like this. In any case, I could go on about different examples, but there is something seemingly natural, not inevitable, about our nature that tries to define the self over and against some other, and usually in some kind of struggle with the other. And a big part of the learning process of our species, learning how to cooperate or how to discover a more capacious community that isn't rent by us and them. And I would say, though, to your point, though, when societies or social groups do experience greater tension within themselves, there is a greater likelihood that they will resort to scapegoating or to othering other groups that are different from them in order to try to bolster their own identity. So a lot of times the rise of us-them is associated with tensions in groups, and then they resort to, basically age-old habits to try to bolster their own collective identity vis-a-vis the other. And we see this, of course, throughout our human history, but we see the temptation of that now, where it becomes so easy to demonize another in order, essentially, to know who we are. There's a comment from a theologian that I like very much. His name is James Allison. He says, if you take away someone's enemy, they may no longer know who they are. Sometimes we depend upon having an other in order to know who we are. That's a cycle that needs to be massaged or broken. Thank you for that question.
Earlier in your talk, towards the beginning, you mentioned drawing from different religions and worldviews.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you thought about the different moral codes that are talked about and how you can kind of relate them to a common universal truth.
Yeah. That's something that the Dalai Lama has been very interested in doing. I don't know if you had him in mind. One of the things that he sought to do is, of course, he works out of a thick tradition. Tibetan Buddhism is a thick tradition, meaning it has very distinctive codes, practices, rituals, culture, language, and so forth, sacred texts. And yet there's a wisdom within it that is worth sharing. And so many cultures and religions have this also. And so there has to be some way in which persons within traditions are generous with their traditions, sharing the gifts, and maybe even helping with some effort in translating for people who don't necessarily share in the thickness of that tradition. It would be, I think, an unrealistic goal to have some universal standard by which all different traditions and cultures could sort of be, adjudicated. So that would be an abstract kind of universal standard, and that's something that I think most people engaged in religious dialogue disavow. They think that that doesn't do justice to the particularity of religious traditions and things of that sort. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something that can be universally shared. And that really happens not through a PowerPoint presentation, but through actual dialogue between people in those traditions, people who are really in those traditions, who have taken a step to humbly learn from the other, to see where there are convergences, where there are divergences, and maybe to think that could be a possibility for some change in my tradition. So in essence, I would say that it is not a one and done deal or a kind of a universal standard that's abstractly articulated and that everybody can subscribe to, but something that's done in the give and take of face-to-face encounter with people who are really informed with these traditions in order to foster something that is open to people beyond those traditions. Excellent question. Other questions?
Thank you, Brian, for including the Buddhist perspective in your remarks about contemplation. I wonder if you could talk about the notion of non-duality as it relates to Merton's consideration that the source of the solution to problems is in the development of human beings and their self-understanding,
Yes.
as opposed to some other path.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So non-duality, that's a phrase that has been used to describe certain kinds of traditions, but it's also a term that gets used a lot in contemporary discourse and in different ways. So what I'll try to do is just specify a little bit to provide a little bit of anchorage to what I might think would be useful in terms of answering the question. Non-duality, one way to put it would be an insight. It's a kind of insight into the inherently relational character of reality. That you could, for a moment, isolate a person, an individual, or an object, but when you really consider what constitutes or co-constitutes that person or object or event, you actually are invited to see all of the other kinds of relationships and conditions that are necessary in order for that particular person to be at all. And so non-duality is a way of naming, capturing in a sort of way of not separating persons, individuals, groups, things, and so forth in neat compartments, usually in some kind of binary way. You know, this, then this. You have this, and then this. A non-dual vision or a sensibility is one that doesn't collapse everything into some kind of homogeneous whole, but it sees that there's a dynamic relationship between persons, events, beings, etc., etc. You could intellectually arrive at something, like I'm trying to intellectualize this, but it's not actually an insight that is best apprehended through some kind of deliberative effort. You can get partially the way there. It really comes through contemplative observation. Notice, look deeply into your own being. Look deeply into the nature of your own mind. Look deeply into how people really are. And you'll see that not-to-ness is more fundamental than binary distinctions. So this is useful and actually very important because so often, this is a Buddhist insight, but it's also, Merton, as you're referring to, he knows this, and there's plenty of non-dual understandings in other traditions, including Christianity. which is to say that we so often try to maintain some sense of solidity about ourselves or our group, and we fabricate or impose kinds of categories into againstness in such a way that is actually the cause of strife. It's not a deep self-understanding. It actually lacks self-understanding to think of one as just merely separate from another. So this is enormously important for things not only like just ordinary life, but this also has implications for how we think about society and politics and so forth. It seems to me that people who are more trained or have a more intuitive and spontaneous sense of the relationality of persons are going to be those who are more alert to how groups or persons can find consilience among each other. Not necessarily in terms of, oh, differences don't matter. Differences do matter. But the relationship, difference is already a kind of relationship. So anyway, I think that this is part, and Merton had this, and I think it was one of the ways that led him to be a very incisive poet, but also a social critic who was quite alert to the rise of ideological fervor in his time in the 60s, which resemble our own in a number of ways. And so while he had his own commitments, strongly so, and he could make his own prophetic denunciations, he was always on the lookout for ways in which the fundamental dignity of persons is affirmed in the midst of their difference, and also how it is possible to enter into a dialogical rapport across divisions. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. But Merton was himself also very much in dialogue with the Buddhist tradition. Yes.
Hello, Brian.
Hi.
I just wanted to say I think it's fair to argue that our generation is a TikTok generation, and our attention spans aren't exactly the greatest.
Yeah.
So just wanted to ask, how do we break free from this sort of like all the algorithms and all the attention and data feeds that are constantly just being pushed into our world and our minds, and sort of step back into this reflective introspection that you're describing?
Yes, and you don't even have to be part of the so-called TikTok generation for this to be a pressing issue. I think any of us who have become accommodated to that will have to ask that question. But for you, yes, I think that one thing I would say, and I teach a class, in fact, I taught it earlier today, have my students in mind, freshmen, who, among other things, we're reading about mindfulness, various kinds of mindfulness practices or contemplative practice. We're reading Thich Nhat Hanh and Thomas Merton and Abraham Joshua Heschel, and people of different religious traditions who have this. And so we have a practical element in the class, and they tell me that the effort to try to have sustained concentration is particularly difficult. That there are certain kinds of habits that have accrued in their lives, which make it very countercultural and counterintuitive for them to engage in these practices. But they do, and they find that even through strategic periods, it doesn't have to be a renunciation, like I'm never going to look at TikTok again or something of the sort, but strategic periods of extracting oneself from the monopolization of your awareness by the candy, the visual and other kinds of auditory and informational candy, getting outside, allowing for perception, for open mind. It doesn't have to be some sort of willful struggle to, I must concentrate and not have a distraction. No. It's really engaging concentration, but also open-ended awareness as well. Experimentation does actually loosen up this capacity for people. It is possible to do. So in the same way that you might say things that fire together, wire together, kind of, bioneurological terms. There's also a way in which incremental practices can also begin to have real appreciable and enduring effects on our basic neurophysiological constitution. It is possible.
I like how you specified the amplitude of our contemporary age of anger.
Yeah.
Today, almost being described as the greatest crisis to man. Now, I'd like to ask, do you see any aspects of the past, however far, that we can try to and aspire to revert back to and bring back, or do you believe that acting in reaction is a negative?
Is your question, just one moment, just to get a clarification, is your question, must we go to the past in a sense kind of like prior to the time that, of an age of anger? Or is there, what would be the other side of your question?
Well, I didn't know if you viewed today as kind of the worst point for our age of anger, or if you viewed the past as a more dampened age of anger, and if there's any aspects of the past that, you know, do not exist today anymore that we can try to revert back to or try to adopt in today's society.
Yeah, wonderful question. I'll have to think about, I'm going to sit with that question, but let me venture a couple of hopefully not terribly unhelpful responses to it, because I like the question a lot. I do think what I wouldn't want to suggest is that our age of anger is so unique as to not have certain important historical precedents from which we could learn. As a matter of fact, one of the ways in which we can appreciate some of the dynamics of our contemporary age is in reference to the past. In addition to that, I think that I don't think it's at all, and I don't know whether this was implied in your question, so forgive me if I'm misreading into it, but I don't think that we need to have any nostalgia for the past either, in the sense that it was better, you know, maybe the music was better in the 80s, which I'm willing to argue, by the way, at some point. No. But, you know, is it better then, and now we are in such a catastrophic time as to sort of, you know, welcome apocalyptic, you know, appraisals of our situation. We have a lot to learn from the past, and basically all of the resources that I've been referring to, even though many of them are contemporary, are themselves connected to our ancestors, who in various degrees and various scales have experienced the kinds of crises which we may see on a more intense, in an intense way. Maybe one other thing that I would say is that I wouldn't want to suggest that some of the things that do make our contemporary situation somewhat unique, and I'm thinking of, say, social media and the kind of like I've used, the phrase that I've used, the hothouse effect, in which everything seems present all the time. That is pretty unique, and I think that has profound effects on our ability to feel like our efforts to change will actually amount to something. There's a kind of paralysis that really can come with that. But I don't think that means that we need to be fatalistic about it. And there are some really intriguing ways in which people who are maybe inspired by a vision of change would also want to look at, say, platforms, social media platforms, and different ways in which we have come to basically disseminate news and have conversations and so forth, who could be incredibly not just clever, but ingenious, with a certain kind of sense of community and a sense of deeper human capacity to allow these kinds of things, which are so troubling for us, which we're barely able to catch up with, to make them be more useful to us, more human. In any case, I've talked a little bit around your question. I don't know whether I've gotten close to the heart of it, but I will think about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Two more questions here.
Brian, I'm just noticing that the last questioner, in looking to the past for guidance about our present situation, leads me to notice something about contemplation itself. That it seems to me that it is a kind of bringing everything into the present, including the past, so that one can be guided by the inherent wisdom of your experience if you're willing to practice contemplation. Could you comment about that?
Yeah, I like that very much. I mean, you know, just for instance, when I teach various, and I teach more than just about contemplation as it happens, but when I do teach this subject matter in undergraduate or sometimes graduate courses, one of the things that we're always trying to do is, on the one hand, see how these texts and these persons and these communities, these traditions, are really embedded in their time. So to have a historical understanding of them. And a historical understanding can make them more strange to us in a way. We don't want to assume that we know really all that they're talking about and all that they imply. So it really requires a kind of patience to not think anachronistically, projecting our contemporary time onto other times. And so that discipline is actually a kind of listening, itself a kind of contemplative practice. It's a sort of humility before the past, learning from the past. But at the same time, this involves, and this is also humble, but it's a constructive part, which is to say, well, what are the enduring elements of these texts or these traditions, these people, that have resonance with us and are instructing us, but also maybe need to be revised in some ways, that there would be some aspects of a tradition that frankly are now for us obstacles. And so we have to have a kind of discernment with respect to that. That is actually, it's not disrespectful to tradition. It's actually very respectful to tradition because, as a matter of fact, that's what they were doing too. So in other words, it's deeply traditional to actually work and be innovative within a tradition, which is just simply to say that is, broadly speaking, a contemplative sensibility is helpful in as much as it entails being open, humble, receptive, but also, as the case may be, responsive to enduring a perennial insights that inform us today, which also may need to be expressed or embodied in different ways.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking.
Well, thank you for your time, and I really enjoyed the questions, and it was really wonderful to see so many students. I'm very impressed by that in this afternoon. I hope that I have done something that is useful to you. And if ever at any point you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me. You can look me up. I'm at BC. You just look me up. Anyway, thank you for being here.